Hello to everybody joining me. I'm Erin, and welcome to the Virtual Education Intervention Podcast. The name should give it away, but I'm here to educate, encourage, and entertain families and teachers who live and work with neurodivergent family members, friends, and students. And yep, you guessed it, my primary location for education is virtual. Sometimes we all just need a little more community, and we benefit from having people in our lives who understand how we live, how we work, and what our minds are consumed with daily. We just need support and encouragement within that space. If you're here, welcome to our community. Welcome back to episode 3 of the Virtual Education Intervention Podcast. We had a couple of really awesome episodes so far, focusing on the community we're building of families and educators of neurodivergent people. We've also talked about parenting neurodivergence that allowed us to dive into understanding what neurodivergence is, the challenges, the fears, the anxieties, and the joy that comes with parenting a child or a young adult with neurodivergence. We also did a little deep dive into the umbrella term of neurodivergence and what that even means. And essentially, it's, like I said, an umbrella term that means people whose brain thinks differently. This might be caused by an intellectual disability, a developmental disability, a learning disability, autism, ADHD. It kind of covers the gamut of different thinking brains. And so today we're going to do a zoomed in deep dive on dyslexia. And I am really excited to speak about dyslexia today because there are really specific and amazing strategies that can be incredibly helpful to our struggling readers. As a special educator, I got into this field because I loved working with people with Down syndrome and other developmental disabilities. I find people so joyful and loving life, and teaching them, albeit challenging sometimes, was so joyful that when I got trained in Orton Gillingham and I started teaching online, I was a little concerned that I wouldn't have that same connection with my students because maybe in my mind, the challenges were not as strong or as hard for them to deal with. When in reality, living with something like dyslexia or a learning disability can be incredibly challenging and frustrating. It's just a different, kind of a different ballgame, right? You're dealing with two different types of challenges. And so I found that I absolutely love teaching reading intervention to my students with dyslexia and struggling readers. You don't have to have dyslexia to be a struggling reader. So these strategies would work for somebody with a diagnosis, somebody without a diagnosis. So I just want to preface it that you don't have to have a formal diagnosis of dyslexia to receive the benefit of the intervention that we're going to discuss today. But if you do have that formal diagnosis or you have a child or a student with that diagnosis of dyslexia, pay attention. This is going to be a really great episode for you to listen to. So I received my training in Orton Gillingham back in 2019. I had just moved to a new city. I was working for a charter school online, and we were really struggling to find the right approach to teaching our dyslexic students. And so, kind of through the deep dive and through the collective resources of our team, we found an awesome online training program that allowed myself and several team members of mine to get trained in the Orton Gillingham approach to reading intervention. And it has been life-changing for so many students that I'm so thankful that I was able to receive that training about 6 years ago. It is something that I use almost every day in the work that I do with my students, and we have seen tremendous progress, albeit time-consuming progress with any student that I've used this with. And we'll get into some examples and some stories in a little bit. But as we dive into learning more about dyslexia and Orton Gillingham, it's also important to remember that our brains use neurons to connect information. Now, I am not a science person. I'm not a science geek, but I like to understand how things work. And so this is something that I often tell my students when I work with them, because I want them to understand the reason that we're doing so much repetition and so much practice of these skills is because our brains use neurons to connect information. And when we don't understand something as well as we would like, perhaps your student doesn't understand the long and the short vowels, or another element of reading. When we don't understand something as well as we would like, our neurons need further connection. And we get that further connection by doing something with a lot of repetition. It strengthens and connects those neurons, much like a well-worn path is easier to walk. The more we repeat something, the stronger the connection, the faster the information flows. Orton Gillingham includes a significant level of repetition, but it's necessary to allow the neurons in the brain to connect better. Before we begin, be sure to follow this podcast on whatever major podcast platform you use, and also like and follow us on social media. We're on Facebook and Instagram as Erin Luchterhand Coaching. You can also access a wide variety of information on our website, erinluchterhand.com, or email us at, you guessed it, I'm pretty simple, erin@erinluchterhand.com. So let's talk a little bit about the foundations of Orton Gillingham, or OG, as it's affectionately called by many who get tired of saying Orton Gillingham over and over again. Orton Gillingham is kind of the gold standard of reading intervention for dyslexic students and struggling readers. It's based off of the founders who did all of the studies, Orton and Gillingham, hence the name. I found this beautiful quote that explains it really well from readingrockets.org. It says, Orton Gillingham was the first teaching approach specifically designed to help struggling readers by explicitly teaching the connections between letters and sounds. Today, decades later, many reading programs include Orton Gillingham-based ideas. The highly structured approach introduced the idea of breaking reading and spelling down into smaller skills involving letters and sounds, and then building on these skills over time. It also pioneered the multisensory approach to teaching reading, which is considered highly effective for teaching students with dyslexia. This means that instructors use sight, hearing, touch, and movement to help students connect language with letters and sounds. Now, I know many educators here, maybe many parents or homeschool parents who have taught reading before, might hear that and think, well, how is that any different than the phonetics-based approach I've taken with my other kids? And like the quote said, many programs include elements of Orton Gillingham ideas. They kind of piecemeal, they take what they like from Orton Gillingham and from different programs. And many of these programs are effective for a majority of kids. My oldest son learned to read from a regular reading program. My daughter started to learn how to read from a regular reading program. She's now doing Orton Gillingham. She's not dyslexic, but she was struggling a little bit. And Orton Gillingham has been such a game changer for her reading. And she's learned it quickly with this right strategy for her. So Orton Gillingham is a very specific approach. It's not necessarily like you go to ortongillingham.com and you order those books. It's a strategy that can be kind of adapted to different elements and different curriculums over time and to meet different needs. I use the term Orton Gillingham kind of as a broadband approach and strategy. I have a specific program, a specific curriculum that I use that is highly Orton Gillingham based from the program that I did back in 2019, and that's what I've used. Now, there are little tweaks that I like to make to that program itself. So in the future, I'll be coming out with my own Orton Gillingham based curriculum that I'm excited to share. It's been something that's been on the back burner for me as a project for several years, and I'm really excited in the coming months to introduce that. But essentially, Orton Gillingham and the strategy behind teaching reading is highly structured, highly specific, explicitly taught. So I'm going to get into a little bit more information about what that means. Essentially, kind of big picture, what that means is that students learn every sound and letter combination possible. They learn the connection between the way the letters look together and the sound that they make. They also learn where it's found in a word, what it sounds like when it's found in different places in a word, and I'll give a couple of examples, and a few other details that most readers don't usually recognize, like is it a voiced or unvoiced sound? Most readers don't need to know this level of detail, but our dyslexic readers do. It's incredibly important that they know all of this information. Now, this makes it a much more tedious way to learn how to read, but it's highly effective for dyslexic and struggling readers. Most readers don't need the level of detail that Orton Gillingham provides because they understand the concept. They're retaining the information. Their neurons are connecting quickly when it comes to reading and learning this skill. For our students with dyslexia, or those that take a little bit longer to learn, they need a little more repetition, an approach like Orton Gillingham, or one of the approaches based off of Orton Gillingham, can be a really effective way for them to learn. Now, I'm going to preface that with, it takes a long time. I have had students for 2.5 years, and they're maybe 75% of the way done with the program. We go at their pace, so that does impact the speed at which a student goes through this program, but it's incredibly effective. And so if you take a student who was reading two or three grade levels below their grade level when we started, now in 2 years, they're almost caught up to grade level, or they're caught up to grade level, or they're reading with a much higher fluency rate, that to me is a win. But what's more of a win is the confidence that they gain from this program. Now I'm going to get into the reason behind that in a little bit before I kind of go off of on my rabbit trail. I get so excited about this because I feel like with dyslexia, there is a tool, there is a strategy that is almost always effective. And you don't always have that when you're working with neurodivergence or disability, right? There's not always one strategy that works when you're teaching an individual with autism or with Down syndrome or with ADHD. There are strategies that can be really effective. But when it comes to dyslexia and Orton Gillingham, this is such a great strategy that's highly effective. And so I love being able to confidently say to the families that I work with, I have something that's going to help you, and I know how to make it work for your child. So that's one of my favorite things that I love about Orton Gillingham. Now, can it be done successfully online? This is something I get asked a lot. When it comes to reading intervention, especially multisensory reading intervention, is it more effective to do it in person, or is it more effective to do it online? And to that I say, yes. It really truly depends on the student, on the teacher, on the environment in which you are. If your child is a child that does not sit still in front of a screen for more than 3 minutes at a time, then in person might be the more effective way to teach. However, if you have a student that engages online and can connect in either in conversation or topic, or they'll follow directions and they'll engage a little bit online, then the virtual world for dyslexic learning and for Orton Gillingham can be highly, highly effective. Like I said before, I've had students for multiple years and they're still working together. I had this student, we're going to call him Caleb. I've changed his name for privacy. Caleb came as a second grader, and his mom had been homeschooling and working with him for several years and really giving everything that she had to teaching him how to read. And she had homeschooled multiple children before Caleb and was struggling to get him to understand this concept and retain it. He would make sense of it in the moment with her, but then the next day it was as if he had never even heard it before. And so she had tried a lot of different strategies, and she finally came and she said, well, let's try. I need to help my child learn how to read. He's in second grade. He's really struggling. And so we sat down, we did a baseline assessment, and we determined where to start with him in the program. And I've been working with Caleb for almost 2.5 years now, and he has made tremendous growth. He's now in the fourth or fifth grade. I'd have to check. He's now in the fourth or fifth grade, and he's reading close to grade level. His fluency has increased, and he feels confident. If you would have asked him 2 years ago what his favorite subject in school was, it would not have been reading. Now, after going through the majority of the program, he started in the very beginning of the program. He's now on like maybe lesson 84, 85 or something out of 108, and he feels confident. He is reading fluently. He is increasing the speed in which he reads. He self-corrects his reading. It's beautiful. Now, he's going to need a little practice and continued support as he finishes the program, because that's just the way that his dyslexic brain works. That repetition is so important. Some of these skills, if you don't use it, you slowly lose it. For me, that was math. Growing up, I could sit with my mother, the math teacher, God bless her, and I could learn something with her, and I could learn something in my math class, and I could do it in the moment. But unless I did it with consistent repetition, it was like a black hole in my brain where the information just went to die. And to be able to retain it and pull it up later was incredibly challenging. Or to be able to remember the nuance of solving a math problem was really challenging for me. And our dyslexic students feel the same way about reading. And so this is a skill that's so important to continue to practice and retain over time. Now, the way, like we said, the neurons in the brain, they need that extra time to connect. They need that extra repetition to connect and grow and strengthen. And over time, the stronger the connection, the faster the information flows. Okay, I kind of liken it to a river, right? A river didn't start off as this giant river. It started off as maybe a trickle, and then it became a creek and a stream, and then eventually it became this river, and the water flows fast. It's the same way with the way that our brains are made with learning new information. Our dyslexic learners, they need to start off with that trickle. And then eventually that trickle becomes a stream and a river, and the information flows quickly. Like I said, I'm not a sciencey person, but to me that helps our students learn so much to give themselves grace and to be able to celebrate, man, my neurons are connecting. I love it. I've had several other students be really successful with the Orton Gillingham approach. I've had multiple students, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th grade, walk through the program. And one of the reasons it is so successful is because the program allows for only fair reading and spelling. And what that means, as students learn every new phoneme, every new sound combination, and I'll give you some examples, they're only expected to read and spell what they have been taught so far. So if my student is on lesson 20, I am not asking them to read or spell anything except the sounds they've learned from lesson 0 to lesson 20. Lesson 21 through 108 is going to come later. So if my students only learned 20 phonemes plus the letters of the alphabet, that is all that will be included in the reading that they're expected to do. But guess what? That might sound like not a lot, or, kind of probably going to have funny words or funny sentences. And it's okay if the reading passage doesn't make sense and it's goofy, because my student feels successful. Because they have had consistent repetition and practice, and they know those sounds 0 to 20, and they're going to be successful in reading that passage, which is probably something that they've never felt before when it comes to reading or spelling. Orton Gillingham does a double duty with reading and spelling, which I love. But once your student has that taste of success for reading when they didn't have it before, they are hooked. Of course, you want to get student buy-in. Of course, you need to include relationship building and rapport and connection with your students, regardless of the intervention that you're doing. But when your student tastes success in an area that they didn't have before, they are bought in. They are willing to put in the work because they believe it's going to work. They believe that now they have a solution to their problem. And you have the privilege of delivering that solution. So we're going to get into some of the details of Orton Gillingham in a little bit. But one of the reasons that I love the program that I'm using, which is the virtual program, I will use this whether I'm sitting with a student next to them or if I'm online with them. I'm using my computer to deliver this program because it is condensed in one place. You're including the repetition. You're including the kinesthetic movement that students are doing. That's kind of built into the Orton Gillingham approach. You're including the visual drill, the auditory drill, the blending drill, all of the components of Orton Gillingham that I'll walk through with you. But you're doing it in a visually non-cluttered way. So in a little bit, we'll walk through a few Orton Gillingham-based curriculums to explore. But one of the challenges that I find with curriculums like that is they offer a lot of multisensory approaches. Great. I love it. That's Orton Gillingham. However, it tends to be visually cluttered. So for example, in the program that I was using with my daughter, there were worksheets, there were flashcards, there were these little cue cards to tell her that it's a vowel team or an open and closed vowel. There's green flashcards and yellow flashcards, and they have different meanings. And it all makes sense to me, and I like the curriculum, but it was visually overwhelming to her. And so I'm doing Orton Gillingham with her, and it's the same content and the same concept and the same information, but there's one thing on the screen in front of her. Maybe there's two things on the screen in front of her, and her eyes can focus on it, and she can get rid of the clutter, the visual clutter around her, and she can focus. And so maybe that's beyond dyslexia. Maybe that's a focus thing. But we also know that neurodivergence comes in comorbid fashion. So if you have ADHD, there's a 30% chance you're also going to be dyslexic. And so perhaps if you need something for your student to really focus on and they're struggling with the visual clutter of other curriculums, a virtual Orton Gillingham program may be just what they need. It's a really, really great approach. That's why, even if your students are not dyslexic, but they are struggling to retain what they're reading and what they're learning to read, Orton Gillingham might be a great approach. And that might mean that they go a little bit faster than dyslexic students, and that's okay. That's great. But Orton Gillingham works for struggling readers and not just dyslexic students. One of the things we're going to talk about next is the scope and sequence of Orton Gillingham, as well as what the lesson includes. I'm typing on my notes so I don't forget. I'm a teacher. I always have paper and notes to take. So if something pops into my head, I'm going to type it down so I don't forget. The scope and sequence of Orton Gillingham includes 108 phonemic lessons. That means they're learning 108 sounds and letter connections. Now, I will say there are a few lessons that include syllable division or more specific rules where you're not necessarily learning a new sound, but you're learning how to use those sounds in longer words. But for the most part, every lesson is a new sound. And so, for example, what that means is you're going to learn that when you put an O and a Y together, it's going to say oi. But your dyslexic student's going to learn beyond that. They're going to learn, okay, if I have an O and a Y together, it's going to say oi. But it has to be at the end of a word. Because even if I hear oi in the middle of a word, it's not going to be spelled O-Y. It's going to be spelled O-I. And those are two different lessons. O-Y and O-I are two different lessons spread apart in our curriculum. But that's the big picture of what they're going to learn. I'm going to learn that O-Y says oi. It comes at the end of a word, often the end of a one-syllable word, like boy, toy, soy. I'm also going to learn that it's a voiced sound. If you take your fingers or your hand, and you put it up against your throat and you make the sound oi, you're going to feel the vibrations in your throat. But if you do the same thing and you do that for the sh sound, shh, you won't. That's an example of an unvoiced sound. This is the level of detail dyslexic students need to learn to continue to be successful in their programming and in their reading. It is, like I said, can be tedious, but that makes sense to our dyslexic students and they see progress, which is beautiful. What does the lesson include? Why is Orton Gillingham so different than other phonemic-based programs? Our Orton Gillingham lesson is always going to include 2 reviews. Like I said, it's got an incredible amount of repetition. You're doing what you call an old review. That's the lesson you did 2 times ago. You're reviewing the sound it makes, how to spell it, and you're practicing spelling several words. Some words are goofy, made-up words, and I tell my children it's because I don't want your brain to memorize everything. You need to know how to sound out unfamiliar words. And so sometimes we throw in goofy made-up sounds and goofy made-up words so that your brain can practice sounding out unfamiliar things. You're also going to have what we call the new review. This is the lesson you did last time. So let's say my last lesson was O-Y, oi. The next lesson is going to be the new review. In 2 lessons, it's going to be the old review. You are practicing oi at least 3 times in a row. The new lesson, the new review, the old review, before students move on. Now, even when they move on, that's going to be filtered into what we call the visual drill, the auditory drill, and the blending drill. The visual drill is when students see a sound or they see letter combinations, a phoneme pop up on their screen on one at a time. And the goal is for this to be a drill and they say it as quickly as they can, as accurately as they can. So if they need to go slower to be more accurate, I would rather they do that. But the goal is to gradually increase the speed. They do this every single lesson, anywhere from 40, 50, 60 sounds, bing, bang, boom. They're going through them quickly. It might look like oi, ah, a, I, ink, unk, whatever sounds they've learned. And we only include here the fair reading sounds that they've already learned. So the further they are in the lessons, the more sounds they're going to practice. The goal here is to increase that speed that eventually they'll be reading. It'll help with fluency. After the visual drill, you take those same sounds and you switch it. People often think that reading and spelling go hand in hand, and they do, but it's actually requiring your brain to do 2 different things. When I read, I have the visual clue of the letter in front of me, but when I spell, I don't have that visual cue. I have the auditory cue of this sound it makes, and then my brain has to go backwards and figure out the sound in the letter that makes the sound, and then write it down. That's why Orton Gillingham does the reading and the spelling component, to give your brain both skills practiced. So after the visual drill, you're getting into the auditory drill. I usually give my students anywhere from 10 to 20 sounds, mainly the ones that I know they're struggling a little bit more with. I say the sound and now they have to write it down. So in the example of oi, I'm going to say, okay, student, write down all of the ways you know how to make the sound oi. And as they go through the lesson, I'm going to expect them to say O-Y, O-I, and anything else that they've learned. If they've only learned O-Y, then that's all I'm expecting of them. After the auditory drill, you're getting into the blending drill. And what I like about this is it visually separates the sounds of a word. So if you have the word leg, for example, you're going to see L in a box, E in a box, and G in a box. And students, what they do, here's where the kinesthetic part comes in. They have to take their finger and touch every single box as they say it. L, E, G. Then they swipe their finger, leg, and they blend it together. T, oi, toy. Now, the neat thing about this is even if it's every sound in a box, if 2 letters make one sound like oi, you're going to see both of those letters in the box. You're going to see them together the way that they learned them. This is practicing decoding, it's practicing fluency. It's a really, really great skill. And this is where students really start to feel a little bit more confident the faster they can do this blending drill. That is all review, old review, new review, visual, auditory, blending drills. That's all practice of stuff kids have already learned. It's only in the last maybe 15-20% of the lesson, often the last 15 to 20 minutes of an hour lesson, that students are getting to the new part. That's how important the repetition is, that the majority of the time they spend on this lesson is on practice and repetition. The very end of the lesson, they're getting into the new information. They're being taught the sound, the letter combination, if it's a vowel team or an R-controlled vowel or a bossy E. They're being taught the theme of the combination or the pattern, so to speak. They're also being taught where you find it in a word. Okay, when you say EAR at the end of a word, it says ear. But if you have EAR in the beginning or the middle of the word, it says like earth or learn versus ear or hear. And so it's so important for our students to recognize that the placement of the letter combination in a word makes a difference. So we spend a lot of time practicing that. They also practice specific words with that phoneme. They practice spelling specific words. Then they practice spelling sentences. And finally, they wrap it up with a reading passage. Now, again, this reading passage is only going to include the sounds they've learned from the first lessons they've done, only up until what they've done. Obviously, that means when you're in lesson 90, you're going to have a lot more information. You're going to be reading a lot more detail, a lot more phonemes than you are when you're in lesson 15. But that's the point. The beauty of this is that kids can learn to compete with themselves. They learn, hey, last time I read that in a minute and a half. Let me try it again. Whoa, I just read that in a minute and 15 seconds. And man, we celebrate big time when they reduce their speed. I had a student just the other day reduce from 40 seconds to 30 seconds or 32 seconds. Man, we celebrated those 8 seconds. And it makes them feel like they can do anything. And when you can pinpoint those small areas of growth, they're actually big areas of growth. And this is the moment that kids feel confident that even if I'm not where I want to be yet, I know I can get there because look at what I just did. It gives them the proof that they need to continue to work hard, because the worst thing that can happen is for kids to feel defeated in the areas of challenge. If I don't understand why I'm working towards something, why am I going to put the effort in? That's us as adults. That's been me my whole life. I want to understand where the effort's going, why I'm putting it in. So we need to show that to our kids. Regardless of the neurodivergence, whatever it is that we're teaching them, they have to understand why they're learning it. Now, I'm going to go over a couple of other curriculum options that are Orton Gillingham based, that in the coming weeks I'd like to explore each of these a little bit further. If you have experience with these curriculums, I would love your feedback. I have a little bit of experience with some of these, but not nearly as much as I do with Orton Gillingham. And so I'd love to know your insight on these programs if you've had it. Some of these programs are designed for tutors. Some of these programs are designed for parents. Some of these programs are designed to be used in a homeschool setting or a classroom setting, but they all have elements of Orton Gillingham. And so one of them is Wilson. That's a really popular one. Barton as well. Wilson and Barton are popular Orton Gillingham based programs. They do have some differences. I believe one of them is used more in a homeschool setting or by parents. So I'm curious to learn a little bit more. Lexia is one. Logic of English is another. Reading Horizons. And then All About Reading is a more phonetic based program. That is the one that I have a little more experience with. That's very, very phonetic, and I do like that. So if you have experience with these curriculum options, please leave me a comment, send me an email. I'd love to know your feedback on them, what you liked, what was challenging, if there was something you didn't like. And what I'm doing is over time, really honing in the strategy, the Orton Gillingham strategy that I use, making small minor tweaks in the virtual setting for what really works well with my students and what I adjust slightly because it's virtual to meet their needs. And I'm creating my own Orton Gillingham based curriculum for the virtual setting that will be available ideally this summer on a membership platform. So if you have interest in that, please get on the waiting list. I'd love to connect with you about that as well. Now, as we wrap up, it is important to remember that our dyslexic and struggling readers desire to do well. They really, truly seek to understand and work hard. Sometimes it feels as though there's an information black hole in their brains, which can be really frustrating. But this is why it's so important to use the best strategies to support their learning and their self-confidence. Once a student sees even the smallest amount of success, their confidence will soar and they're hooked on feeling good about reading.